7 on the second part of the Ethics, Spinoza states that the human mind has adequate knowledge of God's eternal and infinite essence, and it is a point that he will reiterate in the associated scholium in even stronger terms when claiming that God's infinite essence and his eternity are known to all. Now, these assertions are strikingly counterintuitive. How can Spinoza seriously claim that God's essence is known to all? This is even odder, given that Spinoza, in his own everyday life, was surrounded by people raised in a predominantly Calvinist religious culture, deeply attached to the idea of an inscrutable divinity, the idea of a God unknown, even indeed especially to those who truly believe. And even if you understand the claim just specifically on Spinoza's definition of what God is, it only appears more extravagant for it. Nobody unfamiliar with Spinoza's ethics, which after all is most people, would spontaneously form the proposition that God is, as the definition 6 defines God, a being absolutely infinite or a substance consisting of infinite attributes. Indeed, one can reasonably assert that even a great many people who are familiar with Spinoza's ethics still do not know or accept that this is what God is. Now, the demonstration of the proposition 47 does not bring any immediate relief to our puzzlement. It is heavily predicated on specifically Spinoza's premises. It is difficult to correlate with any straightforward intuition, so I'll just read it. Demonstration: the human mind has ideas by proposition 22, from which it perceives by proposition 23 itself, by proposition 19 its own body, and by the corollary 1 of proposition 16 and proposition 17 external bodies as actually existing, and so by proposition 45 and 46 it has adequate knowledge of God's eternal and infinite essence, QED. I don't expect you to follow that. That's actually the point. It's very hard to follow. And I should return to this demonstration below, but at first sight it is hard to see how this intricate piece of Spinoza's reasoning, involving cross-references to no less than 7 previous propositions, can amount to a demonstration about what all men know about God. On the face of it, it mostly says something about what Spinoza, after long and arduous deduction throughout the previous propositions of his treatise, thinks that he has now gotten to know about God and little else. Finally, the context of the proposition, including the immediate context of it in the Ethics and the broader context of Spinoza's other writings, does not alleviate but rather exacerbate our troubles. Hence, after demonstrating the proposition and doubling down on the proposition in even stronger terms in the scholium, Spinoza goes on in the same scholium now to relativize his own bold proclamation to the limit of the paradoxical by now stating that men do not have so clear an idea of God as they do of the common notions. So what kind of knowledge do we have of God after all? And how exactly does that knowledge relate to the clearer, it seems, knowledge that we have of common notions? Moreover, the phrasing of the scholium to proposition 47 suggests that our knowledge of God is not a common notion. So what is it? And moreover, if we turn to the TTP, we should see that Spinoza here suggests that common notions, even though our knowledge of God is not a common notion, they still do play some role in our conception of God. Indeed, here he states that the knowledge of God must be drawn from common notions, certain and known through themselves. So, do we know God by common notions, or don't we? In fact, do we, after all, know him at all? And if we do, what is exactly that we know and how? Now, the following is an attempt to unpack all these seemingly contradictory assertions by correlating them with a parallel discussion of the knowledge of God that we find in the chapter 6 of the TTP, including an associated annotation, the annotation 6. I believe that the key to understanding the proposition 47 and its scholium, together with the relevant passages in TTP 6, lies first of all in understanding the nature and role of those common notions that Spinoza declares to be clearer than our knowledge in the scolding to Proposition 47. And in understanding how our common notions of things, or what he also calls our reasoning about things, relate to our knowledge of God. Now, Spinoza's theory of common notions developed in three propositions 38 to 40 in the second part of the Ethics, including two long scholia after Proposition 40. But he also draws upon that theory extensively in several contexts in the TTP. So in the first section of this paper, I shall explore two basic aspects of the common notions, what I would call objective and subjective common notions, which are both in play in the Proposition 47 and its associated scolding. And next, I turn to showing how ideas of reason or common notions relate respectively to imaginary and intuitive ideas of God. I shall argue that our knowledge of the being that we name God is never in itself a common notion, but it is always either imaginary or intuitive. And yet the use of reason and the formation of common notions play a crucial role in attaining that idea, both negatively as an intellectual tool that allows us to liberate ourselves from the common prejudices that cause our imaginary, inadequate conceptions of God, and positively as an intellectual activity which, by means of a subtle shift in perspective that I shall describe in terms of a kind of gestalt switch, eventually allows us to attain our intuitive knowledge of God, or rather allows us to realize that we possess that knowledge all along, as embedded in our simplest and most easily accessible conceptions. Now I first turn to common notions. Now, common notions are also called the second kind of knowledge. They are superior to the first, inadequate kind of knowledge called imagination, but inferior to intuition, the third kind of knowledge, which involves knowledge of singular essences. Now, as Spinoza writes in TTP 11, the foundations of philosophy are common notions. And since he sometimes speaks of the ethics as my philosophy, we can then safely assume that the argumentation in the ethics is, for the most part in any case, based on common notions. Now, common notions are common in two distinct ways. On the one hand, they are objectively common in the sense that they capture something which is common to the objects that they are about. They are common properties of things, while never being notions about singular essences. I quote, "The foundations of reason are notions which explain those things that are common to all and which do not explain the essence of any singular thing." In fact, they are not unlike what Hobbes called common universals in his discussion of different kinds of names in the Leviathan. On the other hand, common notions are subjectively common in the sense that they capture commonly shared conceptions among subjects or minds entertaining them. They are, as he says, certain ideas or notions common to all men. In this conception, the subjective one, Spinoza's common notions are closer to the classic conception of common notion from the Stoics and the Latin tradition from Cicero and Seneca, which also forms the background for the discussion of common notions that we find in Discute. Now, in the Ethics, Spinoza devotes most of his attention to developing the objective aspect of common notions, which he prepares already in Proposition 37 and addresses directly in 38, 39, and 40. In Proposition 37, Spinoza establishes that what is common to all things is not proper to any singular thing. Hence, a notion that expresses commonality does not express the essence of any singular thing, but what several or all things have in common. More precisely, as Spinoza puts it in Proposition 29, a passage that clearly announces the theory of common notions, we understand things adequately in this way when our mind regards a number of things at once to understand their agreements, differences, and oppositions. Now, not all kinds of properties are appropriate for forming such notions, but But by way of exemplifying what he has in mind, Spinoza inserts a reference to the lemma 2 from the physical digression in the second part, according to which all bodies agree in that they involve the concept of one and the same attribute, and in that they move now more slowly, now more quickly, and absolutely that now they move and now they are at rest. Now those properties that he gives us, the appropriate properties for developing common notions, are basic mechanical properties. Now in proposition 38, Spinoza establishes that those things which are common to all and which are equal in the part and in the whole can only be conceived adequately. Hence, when Spinoza claims in that proposition that common notions are equally conceived in part and in the whole, I think he is claiming that they are based on such properties as can be said to be equally everywhere in the things or parts that fall under their concepts. For example, while bodies may have different extension, bigger or smaller, they cannot be said to have the property of being extended in any greater or lesser degree, but it pertains to them all equally. Or similarly, bodies may have different proportions of movement and rest, but they must all be said to be equally endowed with movement and rest as such. Now, proposition 38 is exclusively concerned with those absolutely basic properties that are common to all things, which those which form the foundations of reason, according to, that's a very long one. I'll say it's the demonstration of the corollary 2 of the proposition 44 of the same part. But less general common notions can be formed by considering properties common only to some things. It's often forgotten in secondary literature. Hence, as Spinoza noted in the proposition 29, adequate understanding through common notions only involves that the mind regards a number of things at once. The points get confirmation when moving on to the proposition 39. If something is common to and peculiar to the human body and certain external bodies by which the human body is usually affected, and is equal in the part and the whole of each of them, its idea will also be adequate in the mind. The common notions in question here are evidently restricted in scope, pertaining only to what is common to the human body and certain external bodies. Proposition 39, however, also points to a much broader field of common notions, expressing all manner of commonalities between, in fact, any given set of bodies. Then in the final proposition in the short introduction of the common notion, the proposition 40, Spinoza ventures to demonstrate that whatever ideas follow in the mind from ideas which are adequate in the mind are also adequate. The proposition secures that deductions based on certain notions are equally certain. This involves, importantly, that more abstract notions or relations between notions, such notions as are notions of notions, as it were, or what Spinoza also follows the tradition in calling second notions, and which is something that includes something like natural laws, are equally adequate. I think there's much more to be said about that, but I won't really need it for the purposes of this paper. Now, in the corollary to proposition 38, however, Spinoza also briefly addresses another kind of commonality, which is subjective this time, concerning agreement not between the things that the notions are about, but among the subjects who conceive them. He writes, "From this it follows that there are certain ideas or notions common to all men. For all bodies agree in certain things which must be perceived adequately or clearly and distinctly by all. Since the most general properties of body, such as extension and movement, can only be conceived adequately, all men must share those conceptions," he says, presumably on the premise that men cannot not conceive of body in some way. Now, the justification for this inference is not quite evident. But Spinoza evidently sees a link between objectively and subjectively common notions which, unless they are prevented from doing so, by external factors will sort of naturally track each other. This also means that under such circumstances, subjectively common notions provide a reasonably reliable guide to objectively common notions, or at any rate, to adequate knowledge. And yet, Spinoza does not intend to say in that corollary that all universal common notions are actually adequately conceived by all men. It is in this context we must understand the slightly uncomfortable distinction that he makes in the scholium to the Proposition 40 between such common notions which are common, as he says, nothing subjectively common, on the one hand, then on the other hand, those notions which are clear and distinct only to those who have no prejudices. The provising regarding absence of prejudice here must, I think, be understood in the context of Descartes' discussion of common notions. For Descartes, common notions are universally true from the point of view of an intellect that is commonly shared by all men of sound mind. This intellect is, for Descartes, however, not equally realized in them all. Hence, if common notions can be denied by nobody for Descartes, this only holds to the extent that people are not blinded by prejudice and actually pay attention to them, something they may very well never have an occasion to do. In Descartes, then, common notions are thus notions grounded in the intellect that are potentially but not actually common to all. Now, I think Spinoza is largely aligned with Descartes on this point, and this comes through in the restriction imposed in the Scholium 1. Objectively common notions are only actually common to those men who have no prejudices. Hence, already in the appendix to the first part of Ethics, Spinoza stresses the paramount importance of removing prejudices that could prevent my demonstrations from being perceived, given that, as he says, many prejudices could and can be a great obstacle to men's understanding the connection of things in the way I have explained it. Prejudice, as it were, drives a wedge between the sides of an otherwise powerful alliance between adequate ideas and subjectively common notions, between true knowledge and commonly shared knowledge. And this is what generates what Spinoza calls common prejudices. The TTP describes in considerable detail some of the basic mechanisms at work in the formation of such common prejudices in theology. As we shall see in the following section, religious prejudice, by emphasizing the exceptional and the supernatural, puts pressure on our most commonly shared notions, which are otherwise a reliable guide to ideas of reason. It generates disdain for those truths that are otherwise most obvious to men, depriving them of a trove of adequate ideas that are easily within their grasp. And among those, as we shall see, is the idea of God. Now, I have already noted how Spinoza's formulations in the Scholium to the Proposition 47 suggested that whatever knowledge of God we have, it cannot be knowledge through common notions or reason. It must then be either through imagination or intuition. And when Spinoza in Proposition 47 declares that we all have adequate knowledge of God, this must then be intuitive knowledge. Now, I shall return to that in more detail in the following section. But still, also, Spinoza declares in the same Scholium that the knowledge that we have of God is less clear than the knowledge we have of common notions. Now, this suddenly, on the contrary, suggests that the knowledge we have of God is not of the superior, intuitive kind. Quite to the contrary, it rather seems to be of the inferior, imaginary kind. But how can Spinoza at the same time declare our knowledge of God to be both intuitive and imaginary? Now, the reason Spinoza writes is that, and I quote, people cannot imagine God as they can bodies, and that they have joined the name of God to the images of things which they are used to seeing. The remainder of the Scholium is dedicated to a more general reflection on such mismatches between names and things which for Spinoza are an important source of error. Indeed, he says, most errors consist in our not rightly applying names to things. So if you consider what they had in mind, they really do not err, because, though they seem to err, and most controversies have arisen from this. So, the philosopher does not proclaim that we all possess intuitive knowledge of God, and that same knowledge is somehow inferior, less clear than our common notions. What is less clear is our knowledge of what we call God, which is an imaginary and not an intuitive idea. Hence we can do away with some of the counterintuitive unease of the proposition 47. For Spinoza does not claim that all men possess intuitive knowledge of the being they call God. He does not even deny that many people think that they ignore what God is. But he does deny that what people think they ignore is in fact God. Hence their ignorance of God does not consist in not knowing what God is, but in the fact that they do not know that they do know what God is, but have been distracted from this given knowledge. If men have notions of God that are less than clear, it is simply because they apply the term God to an inappropriate imaginative concept. The reason why such misnomers find their way into language is, again, prejudice. For example, when some philosophers define God as an all-perfect being and consider perfection a divine attribute, arguably, unless they have a Spinozist understanding of what perfection is in reality, they do this more from prejudice than from true knowledge. Now, prejudice becoming common and entrenched here is also what Spinoza calls superstition, which the ethics describes as a deeply rooted and long-standing prejudice. And the point where mere prejudice becomes superstition is also the point where prejudice gains foothold in the ordinary use of words and takes residence in the structures of language, giving rise to a kind of parallel reality where things are turned upside down, and where simple natural conceptions become derided as unworthy of consideration and irrelevant, if not outright contrary to divine wisdom. In short, it's a place where people, as he writes, interpret nature in amazing ways, as if the whole of nature were as crazy as they are. Now, in understanding how these associations of prejudice and ordinary language use come about more precisely, the TTP is of considerable assistance. In TTP 6, Spinoza stresses how the error of prejudice or preconceived opinion must be understood less as false conceptions as mistaken identification. He says, indeed, when men see or hear something new, unless they take great precautions against their preconceived opinions, they will, for the most part, be so prejudiced by them that they will perceive something completely different from what they see or hear has happened. Now, in the case of theological prejudice, such as prejudice about God's nature, this involves that what we take for being divine is in fact only effects of human nature, as he explains in the appendix to the first part. And in TTP 1, while explaining the nature and power of prophecy, Spinoza thus shows how simple notions which are otherwise straightforwardly shared by everyone are derided by the common man who tends to valorize only exceptional things because its vivacious appeal to his imagination trumps the conceptual clarity of the common, he writes. Because this natural knowledge is common to all men, depending as it does on the foundations common to all, the common people who always thirst for things rare and foreign to their nature, who spurn their natural gifts, do not value it highly. And when they speak of prophetic knowledge, they mean to exclude natural knowledge. We shall soon see, I will add a little bit of phrases here, but there's a bit of argument that is missing. Now this, for example, is a great case of mistaken identity. Thus conceiving of prophetic knowledge and knowledge of the divine as something rare and exceptional blinds us to the fact that what God what God really is in fact commonly known. And we end up designating the exceptional as divine, whereas we should in fact designate the most simple and common as divine. And the language of prophetic discourse, in the language of prophetic discourse, the prejudice about the exceptionality and supernatural nature of the divine then ends up being embedded. Now, in the TTP, in conformity with the general aim of the work, Spinoza's main complaint about this embedding of prejudice about God's nature in prophetic discourse is that the dismissal of natural knowledge eventually leads to atheism. And once that occurs, it occasions a sort of reversal of argument where it is now those who do know God who are accused by those who do not for promoting atheism. He writes, "For those who eagerly seek the prophetic books for wisdom and knowledge of both natural and spiritual matters go completely astray. But sadly, things have come to this. People who openly confess that they have no idea of God and that they know God only through created things whose causes they are ignorant of, do not blush to accuse philosophers of atheism." So here within the TTP, the development regarding subjectively common notions mostly moves within this kind of closed circuit of moral reasoning. It does, however, also point to an important epistemological lesson by showing how prejudice, once it becomes embedded in language, becomes so powerful that it can even deprive us of such adequate ideas as come most easily to us, including the idea of God. Now, the construction of objectively common notions in the philosophical discourse plays an essential role in overcoming such common prejudices embedded in the imaginary structures of language and in the use of terms. Now, to the extent that the ethics forms Spinoza's philosophy, and that the foundation of philosophy is common notions, the ethics itself is a philosophical work proceeding through reason and the formation of common notions, already said that. So philosophy moves deductively from the most universal common notions to the less universal common ones. As he writes in the TTP, on examining natural things, we strive to investigate first the things most universal and common to the whole of nature, motion and rest, and their laws and rules, which nature always observes and through which it continuously acts. And from these we proceed gradually to other less universal things. This order of examination is also the order that Spinoza himself adopts in the Ethics. It coincides with the geometrical order of demonstration, which begins with definitions and the stipulation of the most general principles of reasoning, that is, the axioms, which are a kind of common notions, and deducing from these propositions about things that are increasingly specific. In short, knowing things through common notions is best obtained by adopting a geometrical order of demonstration. This same order, however, not only provides us with adequate knowledge about the things it orders, but it also serves to reorder or restructure the order of the terms employed to designate them. It is the latter aspect of the formation of common notions through the adoption of the geometrical order of reasoning which helps us overcome those entrenched prejudices that lurk in our misuse of words. And this is why, as Spinoza stresses in the appendix to the first part, mathematics not only provides another standard of truth, but at the same time helps root out common prejudices in order to attain the true knowledge of things. The construction of common notions within the geometrical order not only provides us with adequate ideas, but at the same time with a restructured language capable of expressing those ideas without prejudice. Now, all this provides us with the resources to understanding why men do not, as he says, not have so clear a knowledge of God as they do of the common notions. And why Spinoza explains this mysterious assertion by the fact that they have joined the name God to the images of things which they are used to seeing. In fact, what men do not have such a clear knowledge of is not really God. but it's something else, while they do not realize that the adequate knowledge that they do in fact have is in fact adequate knowledge of God. Hence the term God in the proposition 47 and in the scholium to the proposition 47 do simply not signify the same thing. In the proposition, the term refers to an adequate intuitive idea about God's singular essence. In the scholium, on the contrary, it refers to an inadequate imaginary idea about God grounded in common prejudice or superstition lodged within the imaginary structures of language. Such apparent equivocations in Spinoza's use of specific terms are far from unusual. Indeed, they testify to a fairly consistent strategy for language use deployed in the ethics. Through the use of the geometrical method, aiming at dislodging language from the imaginary structures within which it is steeped, or as he says, twisting the terms away from their ordinary meanings and redeploying them within a revisionary philosophical framework wherein they acquire a new adequate meaning. Spinoza himself says that he tortures language. Now this explains the difficulties most unsuspecting readers will experience when trying to correlate the proposition 47 with any straightforward intuition, and in grasping the exceedingly self-referential character of the demonstration with its 7 cross-references in the space of a single sentence. The demonstration not only aims at demonstrating that we have an idea of God, but also simultaneously specifying what God it is we have an idea of. It is reassigning the term God to the appropriate idea, while removing it from the ordinary meaning, associating with what would correspond exactly to a more straightforward, non- or pre-philosophical intuition about the meaning of that term. Through these 7 cross-references and the conspicuous absence of anything in the demonstration resembling ordinary conceptions, Spinoza is putting the geometrical method to the task of dislodging the term God from its habitual imaginary semantic framework, forcing us to pay attention to the adequate idea we do in fact possess. Hence, it was only to be expected that a discrepancy exists between Spinoza's use of the term God in the proposition and in the scholium. For throughout the ethics, Spinoza deploys his own terminological framework within the strictures of the basic geometrical demonstration formed by the definitions, axioms, propositions, and demonstrations, while the scholia are frequently polemical and engages with other philosophical and theological positions, often speaking their language. Okay. Now, the consideration of Spinoza's complex linguistic strategies does not, however, suffice to solve the difficulties in the proposition 47 and its scholium. As we've already seen, Spinoza's phrasing in the scholium suggests that knowledge of God is not knowledge through combinations. Depending on the reference the term has, it must then be related either to an imaginary idea or to an intuitive idea. As we have seen, whereas the less clear idea referred to in scholium is an imaginary one, an adequate idea of God, of which Spinoza speaks in the proposition, must then be an intuitive one. That point is confirmed by the scholium to the proposition 47, where Spinoza declares that it follows from the adequate idea of God that we can deduce, as he says, a great many things which we know adequately, and so can form that third kind of knowledge of which we spoke in the scholium 2 of proposition 40, and of whose excellence and utility we shall speak in part 5. So Spinoza here has in mind what he states in the scholium, second scholium to proposition 40 about intuition, namely that, he says, this kind of knowing proceeds from the adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes of God to the adequate knowledge of the essence of things. It's a very, very difficult description. Still, we find parallel determinations in the first part of the TTP in the context of a discussion of how revelation differs from natural knowledge. He insists that they are equally divine, those two kinds of knowledge, but only revelation is communicated through the imagination, while natural knowledge is dictated by God, the intellect. And in order to clarify that difference, Spinoza briefly explains how the mind forms natural knowledge. He says our mind, simply from the fact that it contains God's nature objectively in itself and participates in it, has the power to form certain notions which explain the nature of things and teach us how to conduct our lives. Now, Cartesian terminology, for a mind to contain something objectively, means having an idea of it, or that the mind knows it. Spinoza thus here states what he also established in the Proposition 47, namely that the human mind has adequate knowledge of God's eternal and infinite essence. And he equally stresses what he says about intuitive knowledge in Scholium 2, namely that it proceeds from the adequate knowledge of God's essence to the conception of the essence, or as he calls it in TTP, the nature of singular things. Now, given Spinoza's conception of God, it is by no means surprising that he should declare any adequate notion of God an intuitive idea and not a common notion. For it is difficult to see what God could really have something in common with. Following the Proposition 40, God is unique and no other substance can be conceived. Moreover, there is no common notion of God's attributes, but Spinoza clearly establishes in the Proposition 2 of the first book that such attributes have nothing in common. In short, adequate knowledge of God cannot be a knowledge of a common notion, for there is no such thing as a common notion of God. And yet if we turn to another text in the TTP, we learn that the common notions do in fact play a role in our obtaining such adequate knowledge of the essence of God. Because in TTP 4, Spinoza explicitly states that knowledge of God must be drawn from common notions certain and known through themselves. The ethics provides little immediate help in solving this problem. Now, if we turn to another chapter of the TTP, namely chapter 6, along with an associated annotation, then those texts will offer substantial elements of an explanation of this. What kind of adequate idea we have of God and how we get it. Here, Spinoza aims at establishing that there is nothing in nature which does not occur according to what he says, the fixed and immutable order of nature, arguing that we know this order through certain, what he calls, principles and notions. And those principles or notions Spinoza pursues are also important for knowing the existence of God. And he writes, since God's existence is not known through itself, there's a reference to the annotation, it must necessarily be inferred from notions whose truth is so firm and steady that no power can be or be conceived by which they could be changed. At least, so they must appear to us when we infer God's existence from them, if we want to infer it beyond any chance of doubt. For if we could conceive that the notions themselves could be changed by some power, whatever in the end it was, we would doubt their truth and consequently also doubt our conclusion that it's God's existence, so that we could never be certain of anything. Now, what Spinoza is working on here is that he's trying to say that rather than glorifying the exceptional and declare seemingly supernatural events divine, we should recognize that the universal laws of nature, according to which all things happen and are determined, are nothing but the eternal decrees of God, which always involve eternal truth and necessity. Indeed, when we say that all things happen according to the laws of nature, or that they are ordered according to the decree of guidance of God, we say the same thing. It is in the context of this kind of proposition that I think we should understand the passage from chapter 6 as well. Spinoza thus infers the existence of God from the immutability of the laws and order of nature, arguing that these laws and this order point to divine necessity. Now, considered in isolation, that argument seems straightforward enough. It's almost like an argument for design. In the Spinozist context, however, it is somewhat disconcerting. First sight, it resembles the kind of argument that Spinoza rejects in the appendix to the first part, when arguing that order is a merely relative concept that states nothing about the nature of things, but only something about how they affect us and our imagination. Moreover, when seen in light what he had written in the Proposition 47 about our adequate knowledge of God, and in TTP 1, that our mind contained God's nature objectively in itself, it is most surprising that Spinoza should here now base the whole development on the premise that God's existence is not known through itself. Of course, one might sidestep the problem by reading the passage as saying that even when known, the existence of God is not known through itself. This, however, generates an even worse conflict with the very definition of God as substance, for substance is, by definition, conceived through itself. Okay, so we have a real problem here. And Spinoza himself realized that there was a need for clarification. While composing some additional notes for a projected but never published second edition of the TTP, he thus added an explanatory note, today known as the annotation 6. To the extent that the annotation was designed to iron out philosophical ambiguities in the original text, Spinoza presumably attempted to be as precise and succinct as possible. It therefore deserves a very close scrutiny. So I have divided the annotation into two parts for analytic purposes, and I shall comment on them in turn. So here is the first part. So long as the idea we have of God himself is not clear and distinct but confused, we doubt God's existence, and consequently we doubt everything. For just as someone who does not properly know the nature of a triangle does not know that its three angles are equal to two right angles, so one who conceives the divine nature confusedly does not see that it pertains to the nature of God to exist. Now, this first part of the annotation 6 brings us back to the discussion relative to the subjectively common notions and prejudice. In order to attain the idea of God, we first need to work our way through prejudices and distractions, preventing us from attending to the idea of God we in fact have. At the outset, our mind navigates in a thicket of misnomers, applying the name of God to the wrong things. If, however, we attend to the idea which is in fact the idea of God, we will see that it pertains to the nature of God to exist. Hence, what Spinoza had in mind with his argument for God, order was not an a posteriori argument from design or order, but rather an argument aiming at showing how the consideration of the order of things according to natural laws helps us orient our attention away from prejudices about God and apply the name God to the right object. Once we manage to do that, we realize that the existence of God must follow a priori from God's essence. But what exactly does it mean to attend to the fixed and immutable order of nature? Spinoza mobilizes a comparison between the adequate conception of a triangle, means the conception of a being whose essence is to have three angles, the sum of which is two right angles, on one hand, and then on the other, a conception of a being God, the essence of which is to exist. The appeal to a mathematical analogy is, I think, significant. By employing it, Spinoza, of course, displays an ambition to attain knowledge of God's essence that has the same self-evident quality as a mathematical truth, in conformity with the Cartesian paradigm of thinking to which Spinozism generally belongs. It reveals the kind of confidence in mathematics that Spinoza also displays when writing to Burke, that he knows having found the true philosophy, in the same way, and I quote, in the same way you know that the three angles of a triangle are equal to two right angles, and no one will deny that this is enough, not if his brain is healthy, for the true is the indicator both of itself and of the false. So I think that's the primary meaning of this mathematical analogy. But it does, however, also indicate what kind of order, namely mathematical order, and what kind of laws it is that might help us direct our attention properly to the essence of God, namely such natural laws as can be grasped as axioms. In short, when Spinoza appeals to the consideration of fixed and immutable order of nature as a means to know God, we should take the notion of order in the sense of geometrical order of demonstration adopted by Spinoza himself. And when Spinoza, in the original passage of TTP 6, argues that God's existence must necessarily be inferred from notions whose truth is so firm and steady that no power can be or be conceived by which they could be changed, the notions he has in mind are self-evident truths that a geometrical demonstration would present as axioms. Now, in the second part of the annotation 6, Spinoza goes on to specify how the argument is then supposed to go. He writes, "For us to be able to conceive God's nature clearly and distinctly, we must attend to certain very simple notions called common notions, and connect with them those pertaining to the divine nature. If we do that, it becomes evident to us, first, that God exists necessarily and is everywhere, next, that whatever we conceive involves in itself the nature of God and is conceived through it, and finally, that everything we conceive adequately is true. But on these matters, see the preface of the book entitled The Principles of Philosophy, demonstrated in a geometric manner." Now, how do we connect, whatever that means, how do we connect very simple notions, simple common notions, to other notions pertaining to divine nature? What does this mean? Now, the very simple notions Spinoza has in mind here can best be understood in terms of the examples of the most universal common notions that he speaks of in the Proposition 38, and of which he provides two examples in the second lemma in the physical digression, namely, on the one hand, extension, and on the other, motion and rest. Both here understood as common properties of all bodies. Similar, however, on the side of thought, we can also say that, for example, thought and intellect are common properties of all minds. Now, such most universal notions serve to explain the nature of things, as Spinoza puts it in TTP 1, in the sense that all things are conceived through those notions. If they are most universal, such general common notions are, however, not necessarily simple or decomposable into more primitive or indecomposable into more primitive components through which they are conceived. Motion and rest, for example, are universal properties of all bodies. Intellection is a universal property of all minds. But none of these two most universal properties are simple, in the sense that their conception does not require the conception of anything else. For in order to conceive of motion and rest, there must be conceived something that is moving and resting, that is a body, or extended being, which does the moving. And similarly, in order for there to be intellection or understanding of something, there must be thought, or something with which the understanding is done. Motion and rest and intellection are thus conceived through something else, namely respectively through extension and thought. The general common notions of extension and thought, however, are simple in the requisite sense. All things are conceived through them, but they are not themselves conceived through anything else. When Spinoza speaks of very simple notions in annotation 6, I think then it is exactly extension and thought that he has in mind, understood as the most universal common properties of things which are also simple, that it is not conceived through anything else. Now, these very simple common notions of extension and thought do not as such constitute knowledge of God. As we've already seen, there can be no common notions of a unique God whose attributes have nothing in common. And indeed, considered as common notions, extension and thought do not pertain to the divine nature, that is, to substance. But they pertain to all those things, that is, to all those modes, finite and infinite, which are conceived through them. Hence, we must say that under the aspect of being common notions, through which all things are conceived, the notions of extension and thought pertain to the knowledge of things, of God. And yet, under another aspect, namely to the extent that extension of thought are also very simple notions and not conceived through anything else, they must pertain to the divine nature. For if extension and thought cannot be conceived through anything else, and that everything is conceived through them, then the very fact that we do conceive of bodies and of ideas and of minds demonstrates that we must also conceive of that through which those bodies and ideas and minds are conceived. That is, we must conceive extension of thought, and we must conceive of these in the only way in which they can be conceived, namely through themselves. But in that case, however, we do in fact implicitly conceive of the singular essence of God, since otherwise we would conceive nothing at all. Now, I think it is worth noting that this is the exact deductive strategy that Spinoza will pursue in the first two propositions of the second part of ethics when demonstrating that thought and extensions are attributes of God, and that God is res extensa, res cogitans. He infers from the fact that there are singular thoughts, that there belongs to God an attribute whose concept all singular thoughts involve, and symmetrically from the fact that there are singular bodies, that there belongs to God an attribute whose concept all singular bodies involve. Hence, extension and thought can be, and in fact are, conceived under two distinct aspects. Under one aspect, pertaining to reason, they are very simple common notions through which we conceive of things. And under another aspect, pertaining to intuition, they are grasped as attributes conceived through themselves, which constitute the singular essence of God. And when Spinoza affirms in TTP 6 that we can use common notions or reason to obtain knowledge of God, even though God's essence can only be grasped by intuition, what he has in mind is this kind of change in the perception of the same relation, so a gestalt switch, from which considering a thing A and its most simple property B, to considering B as an attribute of which A is a mode. Once we grasp extension and thought with reason as a very simple common notion, we only need to flip them around, so to speak, in order to conceive them intuitively as pertaining to the singular essence of God, by considering such simple properties that are referred to all bodies, thought and extension, and referring them to the concept of God as the being to whom belong all conceivable attributes, we can move from knowing things to knowing the essence of God, by shifting the perspective upon the relation they maintain, from considering thought and extension as properties common to all minds and bodies, to now suddenly consider minds and bodies as modes of thought and extension. For example, from forming the common notion that all bodies are conceived as extended, and that extension itself is not conceived through anything else, it is a very short, and Spinoza thinks, legitimate step to the conclusion that extension is that in which bodies are and through which they are conceived without extension itself being or being conceived through anything else, and thus through the intuitive knowledge that extension is a divine attribute in accordance with the conception of such attributes in the ethics. Hence, as Spinoza puts it in the annotation 6, by only a slight shift in perspective, it becomes evident to us, he says, first, that God exists necessarily and is everywhere, and next, that whatever we conceive involves in itself the nature of God and is conceived through him. Moreover, when he explains in the Proposition 47 that men do not have so clear a knowledge of God as they do of the common notions, the underlying suggestion is that we should employ this way the conception of common notions as an intellectual springboard in order to reach the intuition about God's essence, which in fact underlies each and every of our adequate conceptions. It is in this exact sense that annotation 6 suggests that in order to shed ourselves of prejudice and know God, we must attain to certain very simple notions called common notions and connect with them those pertaining to the divine nature. So the connection here is for me the switch. Whenever we conceive something adequately through common notion, it involves conceiving adequately something through which all things are conceived, but which is not in itself conceived through something else, such as thought and extension. And regardless of whether we conceive these universally common properties in singular things understood as wholes with parts, or those same things understood as parts of wholes, this knowledge affords us an opportunity to know God through a slight change of perspective. Certainly such an adequate conception of things is not in itself knowledge of God, because it is knowledge through common notions, but it necessarily involves intuitive knowledge of God as an underlying premise of my knowledge of things. In fact, the smallest act of reason is a window to our knowledge of God. God is present in our simplest notions about even the smallest of things. And this is what Spinoza stresses in the demonstration to the Proposition 46 when writing at whether the thing is considered as a part or as a whole, its idea whether of the whole or a part will involve God's eternal and infinite essence. So what gives knowledge of an eternal infinite essence of God is common to all and is equally in the part and in the whole, and so this knowledge will be adequate. Okay, I'll get to the conclusion. Okay, so first upshot of this is that God is never known by reason. There is no common notion of God, in the objective sense of common. The idea of what we call God can be imaginary and inadequate, and in that case, it is an idea of God only in name, and in fact, a product of our common prejudice and superstition. Or, the idea of God can be intuitive, and in that case, it is an idea that we all have, although we are not always aware that that idea is in fact an idea of God. Hence, God is not known by reason, and yet we attain our knowledge of God through reason. Reason and common notions play a crucial role in reorienting men's attention from their inadequate imaginary ideas of God to the adequate intuitive one that they in fact possess. Hence, the Proposition 47 with its scholium and its seemingly extraordinary epistemological optimism still points to a double challenge for the intellect. On the one hand, our use of language must be purged of the common prejudices lingering in its very structure and in the imaginary ways in which we assign words their meaning. Only in this way will we come to realize that what we call God but do not know is not God, and what we know but do not call God is God. The use of the geometrical method as a form of writing in common notion plays a crucial role in this philosophical reframing of language. On the other hand, we must in our use of reason learn to pay sufficient attention to those most simple notions which brings us closest to God. But it is through the consideration of the common notions which form the foundations of our reasoning, those which are both universal and most simple or impossible to analyze further, that point towards such kinds of being as are conceived through themselves, and thus attributes of the unique substance of what constitutes the essence of God. And those attributes are thought and extension, and that of which our mind and body are modes. and which are necessarily involved in all ideas, in all bodies, and through which all ideas and bodies are conceived. Certainly conceived as common notions, or as involved in the conception of all things. Thought and extension are not known as knowledge for God as a crucial knot. But it only takes a slight change of perspective from considering them as universally common properties of all things that cannot be conceived through something else, to realize that they are in fact attributes of God conceived through themselves, of which all things are made. And it's through this Gestalt switch that the formation of common notions contributes to our knowledge of God. And this given, the convoluted demonstration of Proposition 47 suddenly stands out in clarity as testimony to the fact that we intuit the divine through our simplest notions. The demonstration says, the human mind has ideas from which it perceives itself, its own body, and external bodies as actually existent, and so it has an adequate knowledge of God's eternal and infinite essence, Q-E-E. Thank you.